Okay, so the other two topics that I wanted to address for Parker's back are looking at the relationship dynamic between Parker and Sarah Ruth and asking who is in control. And then the second was looking at the role of the body in this story because it's very prominent. So I was asking throughout the story, who is the one that has the most agency in this relationship? And you get the sense, as I was making notes on this, I got the sense that neither of them is really in a whole lot of control, but you see this back and forth, this almost power play of their relationship. On page 512, almost immediately upon them meeting, Parker says, quote, "I don't want nothing to do with this one," he thought, end quote. And so we see right away that Parker has this intrinsic feeling of wanting to distance himself from Sarah Ruth, and yet he keeps coming back to her and back to her and back to her. On page 516, it says, quote, "Parker had no intention of taking any basket of peaches back there, but the next day he found himself doing it," end quote. So he's drawn to her or to something about her, and he seems not to be in control of that drawnness or his actions based on it. Like, he makes a decision and then the next day his actions are in defiance of the decision that he made. He keeps coming back to her. And with Sarah Ruth, we also get the sense that she's experiencing this tension of not liking a lot about Parker and yet being drawn to him. On page 518, it says, quote, "As for Sarah Ruth herself, it was plain to Parker after he had visited 3 times that she was crazy about him. She liked him even though she insisted that pictures on the skin were vanity of vanities, and even after hearing him curse, and even after she had asked him if he was saved, and he had replied that he didn't see it was anything in particular to save him from," end quote. So she likes him. She's crazy about him, according to Parker. And yet she doesn't like his tattoos. She doesn't like him cursing. She's asked if he's saved, and he doesn't, like, they're on completely different wavelengths. He doesn't see any need in his life or anything he needs to be saved from. So they're totally on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of their view of themselves, of each other, of the world, and yet they seem to keep coming back to each other. And from my perspective, you get the sense that Sarah Ruth sees Parker as almost this project or someone she can win over to salvation. And you wonder if that's part of her dynamic, if she's trying to save him. There is a bit of a interplay of race here as well. Though that doesn't come up a lot throughout the story. And so wondering if that might be part of their power dynamic as well. Yeah, there's just this tension between how each of them seems to feel about the other, and yet they keep coming back together. And I thought this was on page 518. There's this poignant paragraph and a paragraph break. It's right in the middle of the page where the end of one paragraph, it says, quote, "He had made up his mind then and there to have nothing further to do with her," end of the paragraph. "They were married in the county ordinary's office because Sarah Ruth thought churches were idolatrous," end quote. So there's this paragraph break, it's nothing to do with her, and then immediately the first line of the next paragraph is that they were married in the county ordinary's office. And I also thought this line was so interesting because Sarah Ruth thought churches were idolatrous. So not only for Sarah Ruth, coming back to the iconography thing, not only were icons and images idolatrous and sinful and vanity of vanities, but even a church building itself is idolatrous to Sarah Ruth. It's as if anything physical, anything created, anything built and structured is counter to her image of faith and belief in whatever it is she seems to believe in. And so I thought that was a really interesting statement that kind of continued to support her response to Parker. Yeah, there's a line on page 518, quote, "Every morning he decided he had had enough and would not return that night. Every night he returned." And there's just this repetition again and again of deciding something and then still coming back, making a decision to not return and then to return over and over and over again. And when we see this level of dissatisfaction in Parker about his tattoos, that he finally decides, even though he can't see the tattoo on his back, he's going to get a tattoo there. On page 520, it says, quote, "As urgent as it might have been for him to get a tattoo, it was just as urgent that he get exactly the right one to bring Sarah Ruth to heel," end quote. Sounds like a great marriage. And we know it's not. We know they do not have a good relationship. And for him, he is thinking that he wants to get this tattoo to bring Sarah Ruth to heel so that he has the power that it seems like he does not feel he has. And yet, as he goes through this process of getting the tattoo, you don't get the sense that he's doing it to have power over her. He's doing it to get approval, which is a very different relational dynamic. I thought this was also such a poignant statement on page 524. Parker is spending the night in town to get his tattoo finished, and he's trying to fall asleep, and he's having a hard time falling asleep. And there's this line, it says, quote, "He longed miserably for Sarah Ruth, her sharp tongue and ice-pick eyes that were the only comfort he could bring to mind." Her sharp tongue and ice-pick eyes. So even when he's trying to be comforted by Sarah Ruth, a sharp tongue, recalling snakes, and ice-pick eyes, which I'll talk about in a minute, the contrast between that and the eyes of the tattoo on his back. There's no warmth in her. There's no connection that they seem to have. And yet he still miserably longs for her. So I wanted to point out some of those things in their relationship dynamic. And the last thing I wanted to look at was the role of the body. And there's lots of different things we see going on with both Sarah Ruth's response to the body and Parker's response to the body. After they're married, it's at the very end of page 518, starting and going to the top of page 519, it says, "When he, being Parker, attempted to point out special details of them," his tattoos, "she would shut her eyes tight and turn her back as well. Except in total darkness, she preferred Parker dressed and with his sleeves rolled down," end quote. So Parker, his body and his tattoos, there's like the most significant part of himself. They're so deeply emotional and connected to who he is and how he views himself. And Sarah Ruth is unwilling to look at them. And it's the sense that it's not just his tattoos, but his whole body. She's unwilling to even look at him. It's not even touch, it's just to look. And that except in total darkness, and she's pregnant, so we know that total darkness has had its place in their relationship. She prefers him dressed, sleeves rolled down, and to make him and his tattoos as invisible as possible. So there's this complete separation for her of spirit and heart and body. They are separate things, whereas for Parker, they're deeply enmeshed and deeply connected to one another. For her, the body is meant to be hidden and not seen and not experienced. We get that sense, or at least experienced as little as possible. Whereas in Parker, there's this I said, the body is almost directly connected to his soul. And we do see that the internal conflict he's experiencing is actually portrayed through his tattoos, both for his desire for them and his desire for more, as well as even in the images himself. So I have a couple quotes that I thought drew this out. Starting with on page 513, it says, quote, "He was heavy and earnest, as ordinary as a loaf of bread," end quote. So this is describing Parker as a young boy when he's going to the circus and sees this man with all the tattoos who grows to be his, the thing he admires most. And before having the tattoos, he feels ordinary, like a loaf of bread. I love that because it also has images and connections to, there's so many religious images of the bread of life, the bread of communion, of sustenance, etc. And yet he's heavy, he's earnest, and he's ordinary without these tattoos. And so we see this pre-tattoo version of Parker. And then once he starts getting them, on page 514, it says, quote, "A huge dissatisfaction would come over him, and he would go off and find another tattooist and have another space filled up. He had no desire for one anywhere he could not readily see it himself," end quote. So not only is having the tattoos really important to Parker, but he wants to see them. He wants to experience the icons. He wants to experience his own body. He actually enjoys not enjoys, but the pain of them is something that he finds satisfaction in. We see that, I believe it's on page 514 or 515. And that's a really important piece for him. And when he is dissatisfied, and we're not quite sure what the dissatisfaction is towards, that's not clearly stated, whether it's his life, his experience, whatever, that dissatisfaction manifests itself in wanting more tattoos, and having a physically embodied experience to overcome the dissatisfaction. And we also see that the tattoos themselves seem to have this dynamic that communicates his unhappiness, or this tension that he's experiencing. On page 514, it says, quote, "It was as if the panther and the lion and the serpents and the eagles and the hawks had penetrated his skin and lived inside him in a raging warfare." End quote. What an awesome line to just describe the experience that that Parker is having. And so when he finally does decide to get the tattoo on his back, and we see he has this burning bush experience before he goes over there. He's on the tractor. He's not paying attention. Hits the tree. The tractor goes flying. He's thrown from it so violently that his shoes come off, and the tree is set on fire. Parker is barefoot, and there's this moment of change for him, and he walks away. And I don't have the quote directly. It's right in that moment though. And I could search for this for a while and I won't. But right after he starts to walk away from the tree that is burning, and it's this image of Moses being called to what God is calling him to, and he walks away changed, and that's when he goes to get the tattoo on his back of God, the image of God, and as he's getting the tattoo and he's looking at the different images, on page 527, the image that he's chosen, which is, we get the sense it's a Byzantine Christ, and the image on the screen just below right there, it's this sense of solemnity, of the sacred that he's placed on himself. And there's this quote on page 527, because the eyes are one of the last parts of the tattoo that the artist adds, and it says, quote, "The eyes that were now forever on his back were eyes to be obeyed. He was as certain of it as he had ever been of anything," end quote. And a couple pages previously, he talked about Sarah Ruth's ice pick eyes. And ice picks, like, not only is that a very cold, harsh, almost violent image, but ice picks would also be coming outwards. There's no receptivity. There's no openness or reception. Whereas the eyes of God on his back, they're eyes that were to be obeyed. But you don't get the sense that it's necessarily this, that it's without compassion or without grace, because Parker has walked away from this experience changed, and having a greater sense of identity with his name, and he's no longer dissatisfied now that he has this tattoo, and his body has been complete. We would get the sense that there's no longer another place on him for a tattoo to be. He's at peace now, and that it's deeply connected to the tattoos on his body, and the sense of self that he has through them. So there's so many more things I would love to talk about, but those are some of the key ideas that I was exploring and engaging with as I was reading this story. And next we'll look at the birthmark, and I'll draw some of the same themes out of that story, as well as some connections to this one. So stay tuned for that.